What do you think I was missing, ladies and gentlemen? No, 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 no. It's the start of a new year, ladies and gentlemen. Had to put the old hat on because, yeah, it's time to uninstall that old Windows this year, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get some good, positive changes in our life going. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've been talking about Linux for a fair bit. I've always made it my cope session to begin with, but it really isn't a cope anymore. When you kind of realize that the future of Microsoft is basically kind of scary. And I don't know about you guys, but this is the CEO of Microsoft, and he was begging people to stop calling all of the AI crap that they're pushing slop. He says we need to get beyond the arguments of slop versus sophistication. Ooh, is it a cognitive amplifier, as he says? I don't really know. The thing that's most annoying about any of these AI tools is the fact that I have to constantly fact check and verify its outputs. If I have to put that level of brain matter into actually verifying everything, I might as well have just done it myself to begin with, right? Obviously, they don't like the term micro slop, okay? They really don't. Anytime Microsoft sees this word together, it burns some of the top leadership. And you know what? I'm glad that it does, because I don't want Microsoft to fail. A lot of people sit here and think that I love watching Windows fail. And I'm not gonna lie, I absolutely fucking do, okay? Let's not shift gears and try to pretend to be morally superior. No. I actually enjoy watching the failure and implosion that happens over at Microsoft anytime they try to push this kind of crap. But I'm also somebody that knows that having healthy competition is important. We all need competition, right? Microsoft needs to be able to compete and be on their toes when Apple's catching up, and they need to all be on their toes when Linux is starting to catch up in a lot of places. And catch up it actually is. Not the condiment, ladies and gentlemen, it's position. Now, there's a lot of versions of Linux out there, and we could talk, our days off looking at the entire Linux tree. Unfortunately, I'm a normal human being, and I think most people who just want to use their computers want to use their computers. Nobody's jumping into the esoteric versions of Linux like Amogus or, Hannah Montana operating systems. There are certain types. There's Red Star operating system. If you truly enjoy being spied on and controlled, use North Korea's operating system. But if you're somebody that generally wants to know what the best starting point is, there's obviously a few trees that are out there and have been there since basically the beginning of time. You've got things like Debian Linux, which is probably where I kind of started off with. You probably heard of names like Ubuntu. You probably heard of names like Arch Linux. Generally speaking, there's no right answer. To me, the best answer that I can provide is pick the one that has most people using it, okay? Just pick the one that has a large community, because you don't want to be on something that is so out there that, getting it updated for security stuff, let alone actual software, is annoying. You just want something that is supported by the community and is generally the most used system out there. I fucking love this meme. Microsoft is a corporation that turns CEO 30% of their code written by AI into all these issues. Now, one of the reasons why uninstalling Microsoft and switching to Linux is important is because I think last year has been such an exhaustingly negative year for Windows, where it seemed like every month some new update broke their system. And it really makes you question, right? Like, a lot of the big misinformation around Linux was that it requires a Harvard degree to operate, or it breaks incredibly easily. And while some things can be true, I will say that if we're at a point where a commercial system like Windows is breaking this much, is it really bad to be using the open source alternative that, yeah, it can break, but at least you don't have to sit there with surgical, tools every single update, getting rid of all the bloat and spyware to begin with? I mean, come on now. Now, I've shown you that there's plenty of popular Linux installations like Bazite, for instance, which I actually have installed in my Mudabox console downstairs. And generally, this basically turns any computer into kind of a console-like system, where you can just hit the power button, connect a controller, and never even need to really use a keyboard mouse past the initial installation to actually use this device. Now, this is a immutable Linux distribution, which means that at any moment you can actually roll back. So that's a pretty novel concept, right? Imagine if an update comes out on your system that just breaks something. Well, because this is image-based and immutable, you can actually roll back to earlier versions of the installation. Now, this is just one style. The other one that I've actually seen sort of pushed around is something known as Fedora Linux. Now, Fedora Linux is one of the most popular sort of distributions. I think it's kind of the new distribution to get the general normie into the door. Now, there's other things like CachyOS that I've shown you, but I'm going to kind of dive away from this just to show you something that's more general purpose, right? Not more gaming focused. Now, to download this is incredibly easy. You can pick any of these options. Typically, you probably want the workstation, which is the general Fedora system, or you can download the KDE Plasma, which is what I'm going to download because the actual user interface is pretty similar to Microsoft Windows. And if you're going to be uninstalling Windows and switching to something, you probably want to switch to something that feels somewhat familiar. Now, downloading this is pretty simple. You download the actual, ISO for your specific system. For most computers, it's probably going to be the x86 64 systems. If you have one of those like new Snapdragon, sort of like, Copilot computers, AArch64 is probably going to be for you because that's the actual CPU architecture. And of course, if you've got like older PPC systems, you can download this. So it's easy to download these tools and then go download a program called Balena Etcher. And as long as you have a flash drive, probably 8 gigs is about more than you need, you can just install or burn the ISO to this device. Now, once you actually want to, use Linux, you can connect this device to your computer, and while you're powering on your system, you can hit one of the keys on your computer to get into something known as a boot menu. And if it detects this flash drive and you've done everything right, you can just boot into Fedora and actually browse the system, right? So a lot of these Linux systems comes with live exploration capability, so you don't have to commit to anything if you want to play around and see how things work. But once you feel that this is right for you, you can go to the desktop, click the install functionality, and then, of course, it takes literally minutes to get this going. All you really have to do is provide what username you want, a password, give it your locale settings, tell it what you want to do to your hard drive, and within literal minutes, the thing is actually installing. And there's no need to connect to any form of internet service for this or build a Fedora account, unlike Microsoft, where you actually have to make Microsoft accounts now. A lot of the actual ways that they're sort of clamping down on for people to not use the internet to install a fucking operating system to their desktop, which is insane, by the way, when you really think about it. Yeah, Linux doesn't really do any of that. It actually treats you with a lot of respect. It says, hey, do you want to just keep things local on your system? Well, you can just stick there, and there's no detriment to your user experience at all. And once everything is gone, ladies and gentlemen, it looks actually like really smooth. Now, this is a system where I've had Fedora installed, and it's super clean. There is very little bloat installed into the system, and the reason I say bloat is some people say that having an actual desktop environment is bloat these days, which is kind of crazy, but that's where we're at. So immediately when you start off, it's super kind. It tells you this is running Plasma, which is the desktop system. It's actually Fedora. You go through next, it'll tell you that things are incredibly simple. Literally, this is the start button for the system, the application launcher. This is the system settings. This is where you install new applications. This is the file browser, the internet browser, and of course the program you have running. And that's as simple as things need to be. So of course it'll tell you what programs we recommend you install, how you install programs, and of course how much information you want to share. And by default, because Linux respects, a lot of these distributions respect your privacy, that shit is disabled. But if you wanted to give it every single thing possible, that's up to you. It's your choice. And of course, if it wants you to have access to proprietary software, which, you might want, especially if you're doing things like gaming, you can very easily consent to enabling third-party repositories and providing it the password it needs. So done. There you go. It's that easy, ladies and gentlemen. And once it's done, you just enjoy that shit and move on with your life. Yeah, there you go, boys. It's just that simple. Oh, Muda, but what about updating the bastard? I thought you need to open up that scary fucking terminal. Nope. You can just click this little update button right here and boom, it'll do it for you. So you can see right here when it opens up the actual Discover store, it'll tell you, hey, you've got 899 packages that need to be upgraded. Now within the same store, you can also install other packages. So obviously if you're a gamer, you can install things like Steam simply by searching for Steam here or installing. You can also find things like Discord and install it this way too. Now, of course, if you want the more traditional way, you can also go to the internet and find software as well too. So for instance, if you don't like the actual browser they provide you, Firefox, you can download things like the Helium browser. Let's say you don't like any of the AI stuff that people are putting in. I've actually seen this browser come with some pretty awesome functionalities. all without what they claim, no bloat, no ads, no nothing. And in some cases, it's as simple as downloading what is an app image, which is very similar to just downloading a program off the internet anyways. When it comes to Linux, there's many different ways to install programs. You can go through the terminal, you can go through the inbuilt app store, which is Discover in most cases, or you can download files off the internet. So for instance, I downloaded this, it downloads a 135 megabyte file. I open up the directory and it can be as simple as just opening this. So in this case, it'll actually ask you, do you want to launch the file? And of course, I'll launch it because it is an executable file. And again, it will ask you just a couple times, are you sure? Are you sure, pal? And just hit continue and boom, it should work. So here it is, the actual application has started. And my God, it actually feels really smooth. So you can just go over here and browse the internet as God really intended. And it has all the ad blocking functionalities that one could ever want completely built right in. But yeah, to go back to the updates, it's simple as just hitting that big old update button and letting it do it in the background. And of course, that's just the computer doing it for you. You can just sort of minimize it, watch it, do whatever you need. And because Linux is one of those systems that respects the user, you're not going to see your computer completely blank out. If you do have to restart, it'll usually notify you that the updates require a restart. Now, I'm not a Fedora user, okay? I'm somebody that uses CachyOS, and for the most part, Linux distributions, you can kind of mix and match, and generally speaking, there's not one that's usually better than the other. A lot of these things do come with their better functionalities, but as I always say, just use the one that's mostly supported. The reason I showed you guys Fedora is that it's supported by a lot of people just in the community, but also it has a lot of backing from some pretty big, well-funded sources as well, like Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So you generally know that the experience is going to be good and it's going to be a stable system and it won't really go anywhere. Fedora's been around for a long fucking time, as is Ubuntu, as is some of the top distributions that are there. Really, the best thing you can do is if you find a Linux distribution, maybe throw a couple bucks their way in terms of donations, because remember, these are not big multi-billion-dollar companies like Microsoft. Every little bit goes towards helping them out, maybe hosting a server here and there too. So if you can afford it, feel free to donate, right? It's up to you. If you can't, well, just spread the word and use their system. Now, in some cases, Linux is not always free from negativity. Remember, you always have to be careful when it comes to downloading software as well, too. In recent cases, unfortunately, when it comes to things like Linux, there have been issues where computer viruses have been found in things like the OR. So if you use something like Arch Linux or CachyOS, the OR is the Arch user repository. So if Arch Linux doesn't actually have software sitting in the repository, you can go to the OR and download a program from there. But typically this involves that you actually read through the script that the program runs to install the software. And sometimes those scripts can contain remote access Trojans. So don't let anybody sit there and tell you Linux doesn't have viruses. It's about as stupid as when Apple used to say Macs don't get fucking viruses. They absolutely do. Everything can get a virus. The only reason Microsoft is targeted more is because it's still the dominant desktop operating system of choice. But even when it comes to Linux, viruses have been found in things like Firefox patches, your actual web browsers, which is what most people use on their system. But when it comes to things like gaming, guys, I'm gonna be completely real with you. I think the gaming is pretty much where it's at. So for a lot of people out there, I know that you'll probably say, but Muda, I wish I could play this game, but there are some anti-cheats that don't work. And yes, there are some issues with games like Call of Duty, like Battlefield, or Rainbow Six Siege or Grand Theft Auto Online that just won't work because the anti-cheat doesn't support Linux. And I'm at this point in my life where if companies don't want to support Linux, I can spend my money towards companies that do. Now, on my Linux system, I'm playing a whole bunch of different games right here. So I've got, all these Resident Evil games, which I'm kind of on a Resident Evil kick. I've got independent games like Vane that run absolutely great. I've got games that run natively on Linux like Half-Life 2. And more importantly, I've got really popular multiplayer games like Arc Raiders that run absolutely flawless on my system. Now, Arc Raiders works, its anti-cheat works underneath Linux, and it seems like they support the actual community, which is why I decided to support their game with my actual money. You don't have to necessarily play the games that aren't supported. Now, I get it. There's some people that can't live without fucking Fortnite, and I'm sure that's true. And in those cases, yeah, stick to Windows. But generally, even for games that do tend to do this, I kind of just play them on like a PlayStation 5 anyways. Just I install the game there because really, do you want to give a video game that much access into your system where it's running the most invasive level of kernel anti-cheats on your devices? Probably not. I don't feel comfortable, so if games don't want to support me by doing that, by not letting them have that access, then that's fine. I don't really care. Ultimately, that's kind of up to you, the user. Now, back in the day, I used to show you methods where I could install virtual machines onto my actual Linux distribution and run games underneath them. And while that's still very possible, unfortunately, a lot of anti-cheats have clamped down on that method because of, unfortunately, hackers. So even though that technically was a way to bypass the anti-cheat woes, unfortunately, unless you're running Microsoft Windows natively on your system, it's not going to be something that, you're going to be bypassing. And if you do find a method and it's not official, prepare to actually face a ban from an online platform. And I know some people probably won't enjoy that. But for a lot of games like Halo Master Chief Collection and a lot of indie games like The Last Caretaker, things do tend to work pretty well. In fact, I've kind of noticed that when it comes to older games like, anything from like the 2000s or 2010s, or even before that, it's actually easy to install them and run them underneath Wine, which is, again, the tool Linux uses to run Windows applications underneath Linux, right? It translates system calls on the fly. But again, you don't have to play games that are like 20 years old. You can play things like Resident Evil Village, which are actually released in the last few years, and get a quick idea of like where the gaming side of Linux is kind of taken. So loading up these games and running them at pretty good settings. So mind you, I have some mods running over here too, which we'll get to. These mods allow me to add things like ultra-wide, for instance, too. And yes, modding is also very possible underneath modern day Linux as well too. So again, for the most part, playing this video game works effectively as well, playing it on Windows anyways. And again, this is not running the game at lower than possible settings. Obviously, underneath the options for the game too, I have things like not HDR because I don't have that on. HDR on these monitors. If it's not an OLED monitor, I tend to find that HDR sucks. Like here, I've got all the ray tracing set to high. Everything is pretty much enabled. And while the ray tracing can definitely cost more performance penalties on your Linux system, simply due to how some of those NVIDIA drivers may work, generally speaking, as you're seeing, it's very playable. The experience is quite honestly as fluid as I would have experienced entirely on Windows anyways. The UI is kind of fucked up because of the mod, but yeah, anyways, to go to the mod here, if we actually show it to you, yes, you can mod Linux games as well too, but one of the issues that kind of exists with Linux modifications is that you do kind of have to learn how these things work. So that mod that I was using, RE Framework, for instance, allows you to just download this tool and drag and drop it into the actual file browser if you run Windows. But you can do the same thing on Linux. However, you do have to make sure that when you're launching the game underneath things like Steam, for instance, or any launcher, you pass through things like this command, which allows the actual Wine or Proton to switch or override DLLs with the mod that is provided. If you don't do this, mods don't work. Sometimes it can just completely break a fucking game. So you have to understand when you're modding games, there is definitely some user experience. There's definitely some learning required. But even in the future, right, there are actual mod tools right from places like Nexus that are slowly taking some of the most popular modded games like Cyberpunk 2077 and allowing users to easily mod them underneath Linux as well too. So for instance, within Cyberpunk 2077, I have had this many mods installed onto my system, and it's as simple as actually just hitting that big play button and playing a modded version of Cyberpunk running underneath Linux. So something that used to be somewhat difficult to do is also becoming easier as time goes on. Now, I've shown you tools like Winboat that allow you to run things like Photoshop, for instance, or a lot of those popular Windows applications through virtual machines in your native installation. And while again, it's definitely a case of your mileage may vary, it's kind of wild to see things like Photoshop running as if it was natively on your Linux system anyways. But yes, when it comes to things like productivity software, anything that requires graphical acceleration like video editing, I think Linux is still a little far behind. Don't get me wrong, there's tools like Kdenlive, which are pretty cool video editors for people that, are used to that kind of stuff. There's also DaVinci Resolve, but my experience with DaVinci underneath Linux has been kind of dog shit, to be completely honest with you. To be real with you, unless it's a Mac or actually a Windows computer, I think the video editing experience is just generally not there yet. But look, for the average person and for the gamer in specific, I think Linux has gotten to a point where it's not something that you should just really be sitting there laughing at. The experience is pretty much, I think, as one-to-one as you're going to get for now. And I think the experience might be getting better this year. Look, there's a lot of things that are on the horizon. We're still yet to see what Valve is going to do with SteamOS. And if my suspicions are right, maybe they might be working with some developers to alleviate the anti-cheat concerns on Linux. Whether that be just exclusively using SteamOS as the designated OK operating system, maybe that's the route they want to take. But maybe there's going to be something else that comes down that assists the anti-cheat things. Look, 6 years ago, I would never be able to recommend Linux to anybody that just was a fucking gamer, unless the only game that you played was, space pinball. Now it's a very viable alternative, right? And even if you're somebody with gaming parts like me, like let's say you have a mechanical keyboard, using things like CKB Next, which allows me to modify my mechanical keyboard without using a bloated Windows application, even though it's official, is pretty awesome to see. Like Cooler Control, I can actually use to get accurate temperatures and actually modify and get a quick gauge of even things like my all-in-one cooler in my system. Something I wouldn't be able to easily do like this even 3 to 4 years ago is something that is just pretty much one-to-one with Windows anyways. Now, I think the big thing about this, look, if there's anything that you can get an actual, basis on, is forget the gaming, forget anything of that nature, forget the software. The fact that this system actually belongs to me and there's no real telemetry from Microsoft, one of the big things that I've seen from people is, hey, I hate the AI in Microsoft. Let me download the script that gets rid of all the AI. Like, for instance, this is one of those popular tools that exists out there where it basically disables all of the AI slop in Microsoft. This is amongst other tools that de-bloat Microsoft Windows. And I feel like if we're at a point where we need to install tools that are effectively surgically gutting out the system, then maybe, just maybe, you might want to consider switching over to a system that is more respectful of you, a system that is made for people that generally have more respect for your privacy and safety than a company like Microsoft these days. And the direction that Microsoft is headed is not a pretty direction. So maybe it's viable that you start learning the alternatives. Look, it's not even just Linux. If you want to get something else that's more respectful, and I can't believe I've ever reached a point where I'm saying this, but using something like a fucking MacBook is probably more respectful to your privacy and safety and security than relying on Windows dogshit products to begin with. So one thing I've seen, obviously, from users, even in our community, is individuals building themselves some good old-fashioned Linux PCs. So, it's not too late for you to take 2026 into your hands, maybe give that Linux system a try. Look, it's not going to be perfect, but I think this might actually be the year for it. Even though that I think Microsoft will never be toppled, people will still always use Windows. I think for the average gaming person out there, using something that is more respectful of their privacy and security is generally where you want to be at. And even when it comes to computer benchmarks, one of the interesting things that I've sort of seen from the community is how good some older hardware runs. So for instance, an RX 5700 XT, some of you may actually have this in your system, really decent GPU. You can actually see it running underneath, systems like CachyOS, where it doesn't work underneath Windows 11. So literally, it is kind of mind-boggling to see it run 60 frames per second on an average underneath Linux and almost not run at all at 0 frames on Windows. I think that's pretty hilarious. But also other games, like you can see a big upgrade in games like Alan Wake 2, where, instead of getting 22 frames on an actual Windows system, 30 average, you're able to get 46 per average frames, which is a pretty big upgrade in terms of actual performance and how the game feels if you're underneath Linux, right? So same hardware, big difference. Playing games like Spider-Man 2, where going from 50 frames to almost 60 is absolutely the most important thing that you can see. And again, the 1% lows are really the big thing about the situation too. One of the big things that I've noticed when it comes to Linux is that if the performance maybe is a slightly better, the actual micro stuttering is almost eliminated for me in comparison to Windows underneath something like Linux, which if you don't know what microstuttering is, like instead of a bad frame rate, just imagine if the game hitches on you. It just literally is one of the worst feeling things in any game. And it affects almost every like range of hardware from low to high end. And the thing is, underneath Linux, whether it's the technologies that Linux has been using to run video games, I think overall has given it a much more stable design for this kind of stuff. Like, and in some cases, the actual like gain isn't as pronounced. Like in some cases, you are getting 1 more frame per second on average, which, yeah, granted is like not that big of a deal. But again, any benefit is a benefit. And yes, there are cases where Windows beats Linux, but I've generally noticed that, you know, looking at a lot of these benchmarks, especially benchmarks of systems that are running older hardware, seeing the gains people get is probably more important now that computers have absolutely jumped in price astronomically. So if you're somebody that, you know, is running an older system and maybe you need an extra year, maybe 2 years out of your system's life, maybe Windows 11 isn't able to be installed on your system, right? Because it might be so old. Switching over to Linux just to get extra life out of your system is probably better than giving up and basically opening yourself to like security issues and an unupdated operating system down the road. And if you can gain extra frames, that's always something fucking cool to see. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, it's crazy to see how much the actual Penguin has caught up to the point where, you know, I would say like probably a year, 2 years ago, I thought it was a good time to switch. But now I don't really think that there's many reasons to not switch. Again, if you're one of those people that needs a certain game or needs a certain bit of productivity software, I totally understand. But if you're the average person that plays your single player games, like I told you, these are the games that I'm playing on my system, and 100% of this list works absolutely flawlessly on my system too. I think if you're willing to make maybe the slightest concessions in some cases, you might actually have a system that is much more fun to tinker around and play with, and something that generally is, in my opinion, more stable. You know, if we're at a point where a whole shit ton of Microsoft updates tend to break on you, maybe it's not so bad to go over to the Penguin. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Just like if you dislike it, I am out.